"Sir, you have to leave now." The new waitress stopped a CEO moments before a $100 million deal. What if the person who saved your life was someone you'd never met before, someone who had every reason to stay silent? In the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, 42-year-old James Chen adjusted his silk tie one last time before the meeting that would change everything. The merger documents sat crisp in his leather briefcase, each page worth millions. He'd worked 15 years to reach this moment, building his tech company from a cramped garage to a global empire. The rival CEO would arrive any minute, ready to finalize the $100 million acquisition that would secure both their legacies. James had rehearsed every detail, anticipated every question. What he couldn't have predicted was the young woman in a server's apron who would approach his table with trembling hands and whisper the words that would shatter his perfect evening. Her name tag read, Lucy, and her eyes held a secret that would save his life. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Lucy Martinez had been working at Le Bernardin for exactly 3 weeks, and she still felt like an imposter among the seasoned waitstaff. At 34, she was older than most new hires, but after her husband's accident left them drowning in medical bills, she needed this job desperately. The elegant dining room intimidated her with its soft lighting and hushed conversations of Manhattan's elite, but she was determined to prove herself worthy of serving here. Tonight felt different, though. The maitre d' had assigned her to Section 7, where the most important guests dined. "Just follow the usual protocols," he'd instructed, straightening his bow tie. "No mistakes tonight." Lucy nodded, checking her reflection in the polished silver service station. Her hands still shook slightly when she carried the heavy trays, but she was getting stronger each day. She watched James Chen enter the restaurant with the confidence of a man who belonged everywhere he went. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, and he moved with the purposeful stride of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Lucy had seen his photo in business magazines while waiting in her husband's hospital room, the tech mogul who'd revolutionized cloud computing before his 40th birthday. Tonight, he carried himself like a man on the verge of victory. As Lucy arranged the bread service at his table, she caught fragments of his phone conversation. "The contracts are ironclad," he was saying, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "By midnight, we'll have sealed the biggest deal in both our companies' histories." He smiled as he ended the call, completely unaware that Lucy had frozen beside his table. The name he'd mentioned, Harrison Tech Industries, sent ice through her veins. 6 months ago, that same company had laid off her husband David right before his diagnosis, cutting his health insurance when they needed it most. The executives had smiled in the news interviews, talking about restructuring for efficiency, while families like hers watched their futures crumble. Lucy's grip tightened on the breadbasket as memories flooded back. David's confused face when security escorted him out, the stack of medical bills that followed, the night she'd held him while he apologized for getting sick. But tonight wasn't about her pain. Tonight, she'd overheard something that could destroy James Chen's perfect evening, and despite everything, she couldn't let it happen. The rival CEO he was meeting with had a reputation for last-minute betrayals, and Lucy had just learned something that could save James from making the biggest mistake of his life. Lucy spent the next hour watching James Chen prepare for his meeting, her heart racing with each passing minute. She refilled his water glass twice, her hands steadier than they'd been in weeks, while her mind wrestled with an impossible decision. 3 tables away, she'd recognized Robert Harrison's assistant making hushed phone calls near the restroom, calls that mentioned backup buyers and switching at the last minute. The restaurant hummed with its usual sophisticated energy, crystal glasses chiming softly as servers moved between tables like dancers in an ancient ritual. Lucy found comfort in the routine, folding napkins, polishing silverware, arranging flowers, but her eyes kept drifting back to James. He sat alone, occasionally glancing at his watch, completely trusting that his business partner would honor their agreement. During her break, Lucy stepped into the narrow alley behind the restaurant where staff took their moments of peace. The October air was crisp against her face as she pulled out her phone and scrolled through news articles about Harrison Tech. The company had a pattern, she discovered, acquiring smaller firms only to strip them for parts, leaving hundreds unemployed. David's story wasn't unique. It was part of a deliberate strategy that destroyed lives for profit margins. She thought about her husband at home, probably asleep in his recliner with medical journals scattered around him. Since losing his job, he'd thrown himself into studying, determined to find new ways to contribute despite his limitations. His courage humbled her daily, and she knew he'd want her to do the right thing, even for a stranger. When Lucy returned to the dining room, she watched James check his phone again. His confidence had dimmed slightly, probably wondering why his meeting was running late. She noticed the way he touched his wedding ring when he was thinking, a small gesture that humanized the powerful executive. Perhaps he too had someone at home who believed in him, someone whose world would shatter if this deal went wrong. The internal debate tore at her conscience. James represented everything she resented about corporate America. The wealth, the power, the ability to make deals worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yet he sat there trusting and vulnerable, unaware that his faith was about to be betrayed. Lucy had spent months feeling powerless against the forces that had devastated her family. Tonight, she held the power to prevent someone else's devastation. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. As the clock struck 9:30, Lucy made her decision. She smoothed her apron, steadied her breathing, and walked toward James Chen's table, knowing that the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. "Sir." Lucy's voice barely rose above a whisper as she approached James's table. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and for a moment she wondered if she'd lost her mind. What was she, a waitress drowning in debt, doing interrupting a billionaire's evening? James looked up from his phone, his expression polite but distant. "Yes. Is there something you need?" Lucy glanced around the dining room, ensuring no one else could hear. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I think you're about to be betrayed." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I beg your pardon." She knelt beside his chair, her voice urgent but controlled. "Mr. Harrison isn't coming to honor your deal. I overheard his assistant making calls about backup buyers, about pulling out at the last minute. They're planning to leave you stranded and sell to someone else." James stared at her, his mind visibly processing this information. "You're telling me that Robert Harrison, who I've known for 10 years, is planning to double-cross me based on something you overheard?" The skepticism in his voice cut deep, but Lucy understood it. She was nobody to him, just another face in the service industry that powerful people barely noticed. "I know how this sounds. I know you have no reason to trust me. But that company destroyed my husband's life, and I've learned to recognize their patterns. They did the same thing to 3 other firms this year." Something in her tone made James lean forward. "What happened to your husband?" Lucy's voice grew quiet. "Harrison Tech laid him off right before he was diagnosed with a chronic illness. Cut his health insurance. Left us with nothing." She paused, seeing recognition flicker in James's eyes. "I don't want that to happen to you, even though we're strangers. Even though your world and mine couldn't be more different." For the first time that evening, James really looked at her, not as a server, but as a person carrying her own weight of worry and hope. He saw the exhaustion around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her calm voice, the strength it must have taken to approach him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked softly. "Because everyone deserves a fighting chance," Lucy replied. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. James glanced at his phone again. 9:45. Harrison was now 15 minutes late, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on punctuality. Lucy's warning began to feel less impossible and more like a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. James's phone buzzed with a text message. "Running late. Start without me. Harrison." The casual dismissal in those few words suddenly felt calculated rather than courteous. Lucy watched his face change as the pieces fell into place. "He's never late," James murmured, more to himself than to Lucy. "In 10 years of business together, Robert has never been late to anything important." He looked up at her with new respect. "How did you know?" Lucy pulled out her phone and showed him the news articles she'd bookmarked over the past months. Harrison Tech has done this before. They string companies along, get them to reject other offers, then pull out at the last minute when the target is most vulnerable. It's not personal, it's just business to them. James scrolled through the articles, his expression growing darker with each story. Companies that had trusted Harrison, families torn apart by sudden layoffs, executives who'd lost everything because they believed in handshake agreements. "My God," he whispered. "I turned down 3 other offers because Robert assured me we had a solid deal." "You still have time," Lucy said gently. "It's not even 10 o'clock. Those other buyers might still be interested." For a moment, James sat in stunned silence, processing how close he'd come to losing everything. His company, his employees' jobs, his own family's security. All of it had hung in the balance while he'd waited trustingly for a friend who was planning to betray him. "I need to make some calls," he said, standing abruptly. Then he paused, really looking at Lucy for the second time that evening. "Why? Why did you save me? After what happened to your husband, you had every reason to let me fall." Lucy straightened her apron, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. "Because becoming bitter doesn't heal anything. Because kindness is the only thing that grows when you give it away. My husband taught me that, even after everything he's been through." James felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years of cutthroat business dealings. "What's your name?" "Lucy Martinez." "Lucy Martinez, you just saved my company and probably my marriage. How can I ever repay you?" She was already stepping back toward the kitchen. "Just pay it forward someday. Help someone else when they need it most." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As Lucy disappeared into the bustling kitchen, James pulled out his phone and began making the calls that would salvage his future. But even as he negotiated new deals and secured his company's survival, he couldn't stop thinking about the waitress who'd risked her job to save a stranger. 3 months later, Lucy was arranging flowers in the lobby of the David Martinez Medical Research Foundation when she heard familiar footsteps behind her. She turned to find James Chen, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, carrying a large envelope and wearing a genuine smile. "Hello, Lucy." "Mr. Chen." She wiped her hands on her jeans, suddenly conscious that she was no longer in her server's uniform. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see the foundation David started with the grant we provided. And I wanted to thank you properly." He handed her the envelope. "The preliminary research your husband's team published last month has already attracted 3 major pharmaceutical companies. They want to fund clinical trials." Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she opened the envelope. Inside was a check that would cover David's medical expenses for the next 5 years, along with a letter offering him a position as chief researcher at James's new medical technology division. "The company that tried to destroy you ended up creating something beautiful," James said softly. "Harrison Tech went bankrupt 2 weeks ago. Turns out, betraying business partners isn't a sustainable strategy. But David's research is going to help thousands of people." "James, we can't accept this much money." "Yes, you can. And you will." His voice carried the same authority she'd heard that night at the restaurant, but now it was wrapped in warmth. "That evening, you taught me that real wealth isn't measured in deals or acquisitions. It's measured in the lives we touch and the good we do when no one's watching." Lucy walked him through the foundation's small but growing facility. They paused at David's office, where he was deep in conversation with a team of young researchers, his face animated with the passion that had first made Lucy fall in love with him years ago. "He looks happy," James observed. "He is. We both are. For the first time in years, we're not just surviving, we're building something meaningful." Lucy turned to face him. "You didn't have to do any of this." "Yes, I did. You saved my company that night, but more importantly, you saved my soul. I'd forgotten that business could be about more than profit margins and quarterly reports. You reminded me that behind every decision are real people with real lives." As they walked back to the lobby, James paused at the Foundation's mission statement etched in marble: "Healing begins when kindness meets courage." "David wrote that," Lucy said proudly. "It's perfect. And it's exactly what you showed me that night." James extended his hand for a shake, then thought better of it and pulled her into a warm hug. "Thank you, Lucy Martinez. Thank you for choosing kindness when you had every reason to choose revenge." As James left the Foundation, Lucy stood in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the lobby windows. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes. Sometimes a whispered warning becomes a foundation for hope. And sometimes, choosing kindness over bitterness doesn't just heal one heart, it heals two. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey of hope, and remember, you never know when your next act of kindness might change someone's entire world.
Undercover CEO orders steak. Waitress secretly slips him a note that stops him cold. Inside the dimly lit diner, Dahlia Raymond wiped her trembling hands on her apron for the third time. The 34-year-old waitress had been serving the same mysterious customer for weeks now. Always alone. Always ordering the same steak dinner. Always leaving before midnight. But tonight, she couldn't keep pretending she didn't know who he was. With shaking hands, she approached his usual corner booth, the folded napkin burning like fire in her pocket. Cage, a powerful CEO, ordered his usual without looking up, his mind clearly elsewhere, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table as his phone continued buzzing with urgent calls from board members, investors, and executives who needed decisions only he could make. Dahlia set the perfectly cooked steak in front of him, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the plate. In one swift motion, she slid the folded napkin underneath, her heart stopping as she watched him cut into his meal, completely unaware of what waited beneath. Then it happened. Cage lifted his plate slightly to adjust his napkin, and there it was. A simple piece of paper that would shatter his world. His eyes scanned the words once, twice, his face draining of all color. The fork clattered to the plate as he read the message that stopped him cold. If you're already hooked by this incredible story of secrets, redemption, and the power of truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens next will blow your mind. To understand what happens next, you need to know who these two people really are, because their lives are about to collide in ways neither of them could have imagined. Cage Daxton wasn't supposed to be sitting in a diner at 11 at night. As the CEO of Daxton Industries, a manufacturing empire worth over $2 billion, he should have been at home in his penthouse, or at least in his office closing another multi-million-dollar deal. But Cage couldn't sleep. He hadn't been able to sleep properly in months, not since he'd inherited the company from his father 8 months ago. The insomnia started right around the time his divorce was finalized, and his 17-year-old daughter Megan stopped taking his calls. Success, it turned out, came with a price he hadn't expected to pay. So most nights he found himself driving the empty highways around the city, trying to outrun the weight of decisions that kept him awake. Decisions about layoffs, plant closures, and cost-cutting measures that affected thousands of families he'd never meet. That's how he discovered Danny's Diner 3 weeks ago. A 24-hour refuge where he could sit alone, eat the same steak dinner, and pretend for an hour that he was just another customer, not the man responsible for the livelihoods of 15,000 employees. But Dahlia Raymond knew exactly who he was, and she'd known from the very first night he walked through those doors. Dahlia was 34. But the past 6 months had aged her in ways that showed in the tired lines around her eyes and the way her shoulders sagged with exhaustion she couldn't shake. She worked double shifts at Danny's Diner 6 nights a week. Not because she loved the job, but because she had no choice. Her husband Liam had been gone for 6 months now, and the medical bills from his final weeks were drowning her. Every night, she watched Cage sit in booth 7, ordering his steak medium rare, always polite, always alone, always leaving a generous tip that kept her from falling even further behind on her bills. What he didn't know was that she recognized his face from the newspaper articles she'd been collecting. Articles about Daxton Industries' new CEO, the son taking over his father's empire. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dahlia couldn't keep pretending she didn't know who he was because her 8-year-old son Tyler needed surgery for a heart condition they'd discovered just last week, and she was about to lose the house she and Liam had bought with such hope just 2 years ago. As Cage stared at that note, his mind raced through the possibilities. A disgruntled employee? A business competitor trying to sabotage him? But when he looked up into Dahlia's eyes, he saw something that shook him more than any corporate threat ever could. He saw grief. "You're Dahlia," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the diner's late-night hum. "And you're Cage Daxton," she replied, her voice trembling but steady. "Your picture was in the business section every week after you took over the company. I've been serving you for 3 weeks, and every night I've wanted to tell you that my husband Liam worked for you." The word "worked" hit Cage like a physical blow. Past tense. Liam worked for him. Liam Raymond. Dahlia continued, pulling a worn employee badge from her apron pocket. "He was at the Riverside manufacturing plant, worked there for 7 years. He loved that job, believed in your company, believed that hard work and loyalty meant something." Cage's hands shook as he looked at the badge. The photo showed a man with kind eyes and a genuine smile, wearing the same Daxton Industries uniform that thousands of his employees put on every day. "There was an accident," Dahlia whispered, her voice breaking. 6 months ago, a machine malfunctioned on the factory floor. The safety protocols that should have prevented it had been delayed. Maintenance that should have been done wasn't. Liam was caught in the machinery. The diner seemed to spin around Cage. He'd heard about accidents, of course. They were part of the reports that crossed his desk, statistics and insurance claims that his assistants handled. But he'd never seen the face of the man behind the numbers, never sat across from his widow. "He spent 4 months in the hospital," Dahlia continued, pulling out a photo of her family. A smiling man with his arms around a woman and a little boy. "We had hope, you know. The doctors said he might recover. We held on to that hope even as the medical bills piled up, even as I had to take a second job, then a third." Cage studied the photo, seeing the love in Liam's eyes as he looked at his wife and son. This wasn't some faceless employee. This was a husband, a father, a man who'd trusted Daxton Industries with his life. "I don't remember every employee," Cage said defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "There are thousands of people working for the company. Accidents happen in manufacturing. We have safety protocols." But even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. Because Dahlia was right there in front of him, living proof that those protocols had failed someone who'd counted on them. "Liam used to come home and tell me about the plans he had," Dahlia said, tears streaming down her face now. "He wanted to save enough money to take Tyler to Disney World. He was studying for a promotion, taking night classes so he could move up in the company. He believed that if he worked hard enough, loyal enough, your company would take care of us." That night, Cage couldn't drive home. He sat in his Mercedes outside the diner until dawn, Liam's employee badge and the family photo burning in his memory. For the first time since taking over the company, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or board meetings. He was thinking about a man named Liam Raymond, who trusted his company and paid for that trust with his life. The next night, Cage returned to the diner, and the night after that. Each time, Dahlia told him more about Liam, how he'd volunteer to work overtime whenever the company needed it. How he'd talk proudly about working for Daxton Industries, how he'd defend the company to friends who complained about corporate greed. He believed good companies took care of their people, Dahlia said during his 4th visit. Even at the end, when he was lying in that hospital bed, he kept saying it wasn't the company's fault. He said accidents happen, and that Daxton Industries would do right by us. But as Cage began digging into Liam's case, using his CEO access to pull records that had been buried in corporate files, he discovered a truth that made his blood run cold. The safety inspections had been delayed to save money. The machine maintenance had been postponed to meet quarterly profit targets. And the man who'd made those decisions was his father, the previous CEO, who'd prioritized the bottom line over the safety of employees like Liam Raymond. The reports were all there, hidden in executive files that only the CEO could access. Recommendations from plant managers about needed safety updates denied. Requests for equipment maintenance delayed. Warnings about potential accidents ignored. His father had built the Daxton Industries empire on the backs of loyal employees like Liam, and when those employees paid the price, the company had simply moved on. But the most devastating discovery came when Cage found a memo his father had written just days before his own death. A memo acknowledging that the company had acceptable losses in workplace accidents, and that legal settlements were simply a cost of doing business. Liam Raymond wasn't just an employee who died in an accident. He was a casualty of corporate decisions that valued profit over human life. As these revelations sank in, Cage realized something that terrified him. His late-night drives hadn't randomly led him to Danny's diner. Some part of him had been drawn there, pulled toward the reckoning he'd been avoiding. Toward Dahlia Raymond, the woman whose husband had died because of his family's business practices. During their sixth encounter, Dahlia revealed the crushing weight of her current reality. The house she and Liam had bought was in foreclosure. Tyler's heart condition required surgery they couldn't afford. And Danny's diner, the only stable job she had left, was being sold to a restaurant chain that planned to fire all the current staff. "I work 3 jobs now," she said, exhaustion evident in every word. "The diner, cleaning offices after midnight, and weekend shifts at a grocery store. But it's not enough. It's never enough." As Cage listened to her struggles, he began to understand something profound and disturbing. His insomnia, his failed marriage, his estrangement from his daughter, these weren't random misfortunes. They were the consequences of inheriting a legacy built on the suffering of families like the Raymonds. He wasn't just a successful CEO who happened to meet a grieving widow. He was the son of the man whose decisions had destroyed her life. And somehow the universe had brought them together in this unlikely place, at this impossible hour, for a reckoning that had been 6 months in the making. But here's where this story takes a turn that will absolutely shock you, because what Cage discovered next changed everything he thought he knew about Dahlia Raymond and her true intentions. After weeks of sleepless nights, consumed by guilt over what his father's company had done to Liam Raymond, Cage made a decision that could have destroyed him. He hired the best private investigators money could buy to dig into every aspect of Liam's accident, fully expecting to find a lawsuit, compensation claims, or at the very least some kind of legal action against Daxton Industries. What he found instead left him speechless. There was nothing. No lawsuit, no compensation claim, no legal filings of any kind. Dahlia Raymond, a woman who had every right to destroy his company with the evidence she possessed, had never once tried to hold Daxton Industries accountable for her husband's death. The investigators confirmed what seemed impossible. Dahlia had medical records proving the company's negligence. She had documentation of the delayed safety inspections. She had witness statements from other employees who knew the accident could have been prevented. She had enough evidence to bring down a billion-dollar corporation and secure millions in compensation for herself and Tyler. And she'd done absolutely nothing with it. When Cage confronted her about this during what would become their most emotional conversation yet, Dahlia's response shattered every assumption he'd made about her motivations. "Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking with confusion and something that sounded almost like anger. "Why didn't you sue? Why didn't you take the company down? You could have destroyed us. You could have been set for life." Dahlia looked at him with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. When she finally found her voice, her words cut straight to Cage's soul. "Because Liam wouldn't have wanted that," she whispered. Even after everything that happened, even knowing that the company's decisions cost him his life, Liam still believed that good people could make bad situations right. He never lost faith that there were decent people in positions of power who would do the right thing when they knew the truth. But that wasn't even the most shocking revelation. Dahlia reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, worn from handling, filled with newspaper clippings. As she spread them across the diner table, Cage realized they were all about him. Every interview he'd given since taking over as CEO. Every article about his plans to reform corporate culture at Daxton Industries. Every speech he'd made about putting people before profits. "I've been collecting these for months," Dahlia said, her voice barely audible. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because I was hoping that you were different from your father. Hoping that maybe Liam was right about good people making things right." Cage stared at the clippings, recognizing his own words staring back at him. Quotes about corporate responsibility. Promises about creating a safer work environment. Commitments to putting employee welfare first. All the things he'd said to the press, to investors, to the board of directors, never knowing that the widow of one of his father's victims was hanging on to every word. "There was one interview in particular," Dahlia continued, pulling out a highlighted article from 3 months ago. "You said that a company's true worth isn't measured in profits, but in how it treats the people who make those profits possible. You said that every employee who walks through the doors of a Daxton Industries facility should feel valued and protected." As Cage read his own words, he felt a crushing weight settle in his chest. Because he remembered giving that interview, remembered the careful media coaching, the strategic messaging designed to rebuild the company's public image after several workplace incidents had made headlines. But he also remembered believing what he was saying. Deep down, beneath all the corporate strategy and public relations maneuvering, he'd meant every word. "When I saw that interview," Dahlia said, "I started coming to work at this diner every night, hoping somehow I'd get the chance to meet you, to see if the man behind those words was real, or if it was just more corporate empty promises." The magnitude of what she was telling him hit Cage like a physical blow. For 3 weeks, he'd thought his visits to Danny's diner were random, driven by insomnia and a need to escape his responsibilities. But Dahlia had been waiting for him, watching for him, hoping against hope that he would prove to be the leader her husband had always believed existed somewhere in the corporate hierarchy. "You've been testing me," he said, the realization dawning on him slowly. "I've been hoping," she corrected. "Hoping that when you learned the truth about what happened to Liam, you'd do what your father never did. You'd make it right." If this story is giving you chills and making you believe in the power of hope and redemption, you need to subscribe right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever held on to hope for someone even when you had every reason to give up on them? Share your story in the comments, because Dahlia's unwavering faith in the possibility of good is about to change everything, and you won't believe how Cage responds to this incredible act of trust. The evidence folder Dahlia had been carrying wasn't a weapon for revenge. It was a test of character. And for the first time since inheriting his father's empire, Cage Daxton understood that he was being given something more precious than any business opportunity he'd ever encountered. He was being given a chance to prove that some promises are worth keeping, even when no one is watching, even when it costs everything. What happened next would either make Cage Daxton a hero or destroy everything he'd worked for his entire life. Because the decision he was about to make would shake the foundations of corporate America and put his billion-dollar empire on the line. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you love stories like this. The morning after Dahlia's revelation, Cage didn't go to his office. Instead, he spent 14 hours in his penthouse, surrounded by the evidence Dahlia had entrusted to him, along with the damning internal documents he'd uncovered about his father's cover-ups. By dawn, he'd made a decision that would change everything. At 7 a.m. sharp, Cage's assistant received a call that sent shockwaves through the executive floors of Daxton Industries. The CEO was calling an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions, no agenda provided. The 12 most powerful members of Daxton Industries' board of directors filed into the mahogany-paneled conference room that morning, expecting another routine quarterly review or perhaps news of a major acquisition. What they got instead was a reckoning that had been 6 months in the making. Cage entered that boardroom carrying two things: Dahlia's evidence folder and a resignation letter he'd written but wasn't sure he'd have the courage to use. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cage began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I've called you here to discuss something that should have been addressed years ago. The systematic cover-up of workplace safety violations that have cost lives." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as Cage began laying out documents on the conference table. Liam Raymond's case file, the delayed safety inspections, the buried maintenance reports, and then the evidence of other incidents, other families, other cover-ups that painted a picture of corporate negligence spanning decades. "This is Liam Raymond," Cage said, placing Liam's employee photo at the center of the table. "He worked for us for 7 years. He died because we chose profits over safety protocols. And he's not the only one." Board member Patricia Hoffman, a woman who'd worked alongside Cage's father for 20 years, was the first to speak. "Cage, these are isolated incidents. Every manufacturing company deals with workplace accidents. We have insurance for this." "Insurance?" Cage's voice rose, anger flashing in his eyes. "We're talking about human lives, Patricia. Real people with families, with dreams, with children who will grow up without their fathers because we decided that quarterly profits mattered more than basic safety measures." The room erupted. Board member after board member tried to dismiss the evidence, to minimize the scope of the problem, to protect the company's reputation and their own financial interests. But Cage had spent months preparing for this moment, and he wasn't backing down. "I'm proposing a comprehensive compensation fund," Cage announced, his words cutting through the chaos. "Full compensation for the families of every employee who died due to our negligence, complete medical coverage for injured workers, and a complete overhaul of our safety protocols at every facility." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, board member Richard Sterling, the company's longest-serving director, found his voice. "Do you have any idea what you're proposing? The financial impact of what you're suggesting could bankrupt this company. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars." "I know exactly what I'm proposing," Cage replied. "I'm proposing that we take responsibility for the consequences of decisions that prioritize shareholder profits over human lives." What happened next was a corporate power struggle unlike anything the business world had ever seen. One by one, the board members who had enabled his father's practices began pushing back, threatening everything Cage held dear. "You're being emotional," Patricia Hoffman said, her voice cold and calculating. "This is business, not charity. If you proceed with this reckless plan, we'll have no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence." "The shareholders will never support this," added Sterling. "You'll destroy everything your father built. Everything this company represents." But Cage had reached a point where the threats no longer mattered. Standing in that boardroom, surrounded by people who saw human lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit, he finally understood what kind of leader he wanted to be. "My father built this company on the backs of people like Liam Raymond," Cage said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He built it on the suffering of families who trusted us with their livelihoods and their lives, and I won't let it continue." The board members exchanged looks that could kill. They'd expected to intimidate the young CEO into backing down, to remind him that his position depended on their support. What they got instead was a man who'd found something worth fighting for. "If you proceed with this," Sterling threatened, "we'll remove you as CEO. The board has that power, and we won't hesitate to use it." Cage looked around the room at these people he'd once respected, these titans of industry who'd helped build his family's empire, and for the first time, he saw them clearly. They weren't successful business leaders. They were collaborators in a system that treated human life as a line item on a balance sheet. "Then remove me," Cage said, pulling out the resignation letter he'd prepared. "Because I'd rather lose this company than lose my soul." The boardroom erupted again, but this time it was different. Some members were shouting about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. Others were frantically calculating the financial implications of Cage's proposal. But in the midst of the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Board member Jennifer Walsh, The youngest member of the board and a recent appointee stood up and walked over to where Cage was standing. "I second the motion for the compensation fund," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "And I support the complete safety overhaul." One by one, 3 other board members joined her. Not a majority, but enough to send a clear message that the tide was turning. The meeting that was supposed to last an hour stretched into 4 hours of heated debate, threats, and ultimately, a historic vote that would determine not just the future of Daxton Industries, but the precedent for corporate responsibility across the entire manufacturing sector. When the votes were finally counted, Cage had won by a single vote. The compensation fund was approved, the safety overhaul was approved, and for the first time in the company's history, Daxton Industries would put people before profits. But as Cage walked out of that boardroom, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Because implementing these changes wouldn't just cost money. It would require him to rebuild the entire culture of a company that had operated one way for decades. And somewhere in a diner across town, Dahlia Raymond was waiting tables, not knowing that her husband's death had just sparked a corporate revolution that would change the lives of thousands of families just like hers. 3 days after the most difficult board meeting in corporate history, Cage Daxton found himself standing outside Danny's diner at 11 p.m., not as a sleepless CEO seeking solitude, but as a man carrying documents that would change everything for the woman who had changed him. Dahlia was working her usual shift, but tonight she looked different. There was something in her posture, a lightness that hadn't been there before, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know it yet, but news of Daxton Industries' unprecedented decision to establish a compensation fund had already started spreading through the manufacturing community. When Cage walked through those familiar doors, Dahlia looked up with surprise. She'd been wondering if she'd ever see him again after their emotional conversation about the newspaper clippings and her husband's unwavering faith in the possibility of good. "I have something for you," Cage said simply, setting a leather portfolio on the table in booth 7, the same booth where everything had started weeks ago. As Dahlia opened the documents, her hands began to tremble. The first page was a compensation agreement. Full financial compensation for Liam's death. Complete medical coverage for Tyler's heart surgery. A college fund that would ensure her son never had to worry about his education. Numbers that seemed impossible, amounts that would secure their future for generations. But Cage wasn't finished. "There's something else," he said, pulling out one more document. "I'm offering you a position as the head of our new employee welfare division. Your job would be to make sure that what happened to Liam never happens to another family again." Dahlia stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to work for Daxton Industries? After everything?" "I want you to transform Daxton Industries," Cage corrected, "because you understand something that I'm still learning. You understand that behind every employee number, every safety statistic, every insurance claim, there's a real person with a real family who deserves to come home safely every day." The tears that had been building in Dahlia's eyes finally spilled over, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of grief or desperation. They were tears of hope, of possibility, of a future she'd never dared to imagine. "Liam would be so proud," she whispered. "He always said that good people in positions of power could change everything. He never lost faith in that, even at the end." 6 months later, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Tyler Raymond, now a healthy 9-year-old, was running through the playground behind what used to be Danny's diner. His heart surgery had been a complete success, performed by the best cardiac surgeon in the country, with every expense covered by Daxton Industries' new medical program. The diner itself had been transformed into something beautiful and unexpected. When the previous owner decided to sell to a chain restaurant, Cage had stepped in with a different proposal. Instead of another corporate franchise, Danny's Diner became the Liam Raymond Community Center, a place where working families could access resources, support, and hope. But the most remarkable transformation was happening inside the walls of Daxton Industries itself. Under Dahlia's leadership as Director of Employee Welfare, the company had implemented safety protocols that exceeded industry standards. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Workplace accidents had dropped by 90%. And for the first time in the company's history, employees spoke proudly about working for Daxton Industries. The compensation fund had grown beyond Liam's case to include dozens of other families who had been quietly suffering in the wake of preventable workplace accidents. Each family received not just financial compensation, but personal attention from Dahlia, who understood their pain in ways no corporate executive ever could. The business world had been watching, waiting for Daxton Industries to collapse under the weight of Cage's conscience-driven decisions. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The company's reputation soared. Stock prices hit record highs as investors recognized the value of genuine corporate responsibility. Employee productivity increased dramatically when workers felt truly valued and protected. Cage had proven that doing the right thing wasn't just morally correct, it was good business. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Cage's personal life. His daughter Megan, now 18 and preparing for college, had started talking to her father again. The turning point came when she read about his company's transformation in her high school newspaper. For the first time in years, she felt proud to be a Daxton. "Dad," she'd said during their first real conversation in months, "I always thought being successful meant being ruthless. But what you did for that woman and her son, that's the kind of success I want to be part of." The insomnia that had plagued Cage for years was gone. He slept peacefully now, no longer haunted by the weight of decisions that prioritized profit over people. The late-night drives had been replaced by evening visits to the community center, where he'd often find Dahlia working with families who needed support. Tonight, like so many nights over the past 6 months, Cage sat in what used to be Booth 7 at Danny's Diner. But now, he wasn't alone. Emma was with him, along with Dahlia and Tyler, sharing stories and laughter in a space that had once been filled with grief and desperation. As Cage watched Tyler show Megan his drawings of the playground they were planning to expand, he thought about the note that had started everything. "I know who you are, and I know what you did to my family." At the time, those words had felt like an accusation, a threat to everything he'd built. But now, he understood them differently. Dahlia hadn't been seeking revenge. She'd been offering him recognition, the chance to see himself clearly, to understand the impact of his choices, and to choose differently. The note that stopped him cold hadn't been about destroying him. It had been about the possibility of redemption, about the belief that even in the darkest circumstances, good people could make bad situations right. "You know what's funny?" Dahlia said, as if reading his thoughts. "I used to think that note was the scariest thing I'd ever written, but it turned out to be the most hopeful." Cage nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing you can do is believe in someone's capacity to change. Sometimes the most courageous act is offering forgiveness before it's asked for. And sometimes the most powerful words you can speak are the ones that challenge someone to become who they're truly meant to be. As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Cage realized that his story wasn't really about a powerful CEO learning compassion. It was about a grieving widow who chose hope over hatred, faith over revenge, and love over bitterness. Dahlia Raymond had saved more than just her own family that night. She slipped him that note. She had saved his soul. The rain that had been falling the night everything changed had long since stopped. But the transformation it had set in motion continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing futures in ways that would be felt for generations to come. Because sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to believe that people can change, and one person courageous enough to prove them right. If this incredible story of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of hope has touched your heart, make sure you subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us that real change is possible when we have the courage to believe in each other.